Discourse on the Method for Conducting One's Reason Well, and for Seeking the Truth in the Sciences, by Rene Descartes, Part 1. Good sense is the best distributed thing in the world, for everyone thinks himself to be so well endowed with it, that even those who are the most difficult to please in everything else are not at all wont to desire more of it than they already have. It is not likely that everyone is mistaken in this. Rather, it provides evidence that the power of judging well and of distinguishing the true from the false, which is, properly speaking, what people call good sense or reason, is naturally equal in all men, and that the diversity of our opinions does not arise from the fact that some people are more reasonable than others, but solely from the fact that we lead our thoughts along different paths, and do not take the same things into consideration. For it is not enough to have a good mind. The main thing is to apply it well. The greatest souls are capable of the greatest vices as well as of the greatest virtues, and those who proceed only very slowly can make much greater progress, provided they always follow the right path, than do those who hurry and stray from it. For myself, I have never presumed that my mind was in any respect more perfect than that of ordinary men. In fact, I have often desired to have as quick a wit, or as keen and distinct an imagination, or as full and responsive a memory as some other people. And other than these, I know of no qualities that serve in the perfecting of the mind. For as to reason or sense, insomuch as it alone makes us men, and distinguishes us from the beasts, I prefer to believe that it exists whole and entire in each of us, and in this to follow the opinion commonly held by the philosophers, who say that there are differences of degree only between accidents, but not at all between forms or natures or individuals of the same species. But I shall have no fear of saying that I think I have been rather fortunate to have, since my youth, found myself upon certain paths that have led me to considerations and maxims, from which I have formed a method by which, it seems to me, I have the means to increase my knowledge by degrees, and to raise it little by little to the highest point which the mediocrity of my mind and the short duration of my life will be allowed it to attain. For I have already reaped from it such a harvest that, although I try, in judgments I make of myself, always to lean more on the side of diffidence than of presumption, and although, looking with a philosopher's eye at the various actions and enterprises of all men, there is hardly one of them that does not seem to me vain and useless, I cannot but take immense satisfaction in the progress that I think I have already made in search for truth, and I cannot but envisage such hopes for the future that if, among the occupations of men purely as men, there is one that is solidly good and important, I dare to believe that it is the one I have chosen. All the same, it could be that I am mistaken, and what I take for gold and diamonds is perhaps nothing but a bit of copper and glass. I know how much we are prone to err in what affects us, and also how much the judgments made by our friends should be distrusted when these judgments are in our favor. But I will be very happy to show in this discourse what paths I have followed, and to represent my life in it as if in a picture, so that everyone may judge it for himself, and thus that, learning from the common response the opinions one will have of it, this may be a new means of teaching myself, which I shall add to those that I am accustomed to using. Thus my purpose here is not to teach the method that everyone ought to follow in order to conduct his reason well, but merely to show how I have tried to conduct my own. Those who take it upon themselves to give precepts must regard themselves as more competent than those to whom they give them, and if they are found wanting in the least detail they are to blame. But putting forward this essay merely as a story, or, if you prefer, as a fable in which, among some examples one can imitate, one will perhaps also find many others which one will have the reason not to follow. I hope that it will be useful to some without being harmful to anyone, and that everyone will be grateful to me for my frankness. I have been nourished on letters since my childhood, and because I was convinced that by means of them one could acquire a clear and assured knowledge of everything that is useful in life, I had a tremendous desire to master them. But as soon as I had completed this entire course of study, at the end of which one is ordinarily received into the ranks of the learned, I completely changed my mind. For I found myself confounded by so many doubts and errors, that it seemed to me that I had not gained any profit from my attempts to teach myself, except that more and more I had discovered my ignorance. And yet, I was at one of the most renowned schools of Europe, where I thought there must be learned men, if in fact any such men existed anywhere on earth. There I had learned everything the others were learning, and, not content with the disciplines we were taught there, I had gone through all the books I could lay my hands on that treated those disciplines, considered the most curious and most unusual. Moreover, I knew what judgments the others were making about me, and I did not at all see that I was rated inferior to my fellow students, even though there already were some among them who were destined to take the place of our teachers. And finally, our age seemed to me to be just as flourishing and as fertile in good minds as any of the preceding ones. This made me feel free to judge all others by myself, and to think that there was no doctrine in the world that was of the sort that I had previously been led to hope for. I did not, however, cease to hold in high regard the academic exercises with which we were I did not, however, cease to hold in high regard the academic exercises with which we occupy ourselves in the schools. I knew that the languages learned there are necessary for the understanding of classical texts, that the charm of fables awakens the mind, that the memorable deeds recounted in histories uplift it, and, if read with discretion, aid in forming one's judgment, that the reading of all good books is like a conversation with the most honorable people of past ages, who were their authors, indeed, even like a set conversation in which they reveal to us only the best of their thoughts, that oratory has incomparable power and beauty, that poetry has quite ravishing and delicacy and sweetness, that mathematics has some very subtle stratagems that can serve as much to satisfy the curious as to facilitate all the arts and to lessen men's labor, that writings dealing with morals contain many lessons and many exhortations to virtue that are very useful, that theology teaches one how to reach heaven, that philosophy provides the means of speaking plausibly about all things and of making oneself admired by the less learned, that jurisprudence, medicine, and of other sciences bringing honors and riches to those who cultivate them, and, finally, that it is good to have examined all these disciplines, even the most superstition-ridden and the most false of them, in order to know their true worth, and to guard against being deceived by them. But I believed I had already given enough time to languages, and also to the reading of classical texts, both to their histories and to their fables. For conversing with those of other ages is about the same thing as traveling. It is good to know something of the customs of various peoples, so as to judge our own more soundly, and so as not to think that everything is contrary to our ways is ridiculous and against reason, as those who have seen nothing have a habit of doing. But when one takes too much time traveling, one eventually becomes a stranger in one's own country, and when one is too curious about what commonly took place in past ages, one usually remains quite ignorant of what is taking place in one's own country. Moreover, fables make one imagine many events to be possible which are not so at all. And even the most accurate histories, if they neither alter nor exaggerate the significance of things in order to render them more worthy of being read, almost always at least omit the baser and less noteworthy details. Consequently, the rest do not appear as they really are, and those who govern their own conduct by means of examples drawn from these texts are liable to fall into the extravagances of the knights of our romances, and to conceive plans that are beyond their powers. I held oratory in high regard, and was enamored of poetry, but I thought both were gifts of the mind rather than fruits of the study. Those who possess the strongest reasoning, and who best order their thoughts in order to make them clear and intelligible, can always persuade others of what they are proposing, even if they were only to speak Low Breton and had never learned rhetoric. And those who had the most pleasing rhetorical devices, and knew how to express themselves with the most embellishment and sweetness, would not fail to be the greatest poets, even if the art of poetry were unknown to them. I delighted most of all in mathematics, because of the certainty and the evidence of its reasonings. But I did not yet notice its true use, and, thinking that it was of service merely to the mechanical arts, I was astonished by the fact that no one had built anything more noble upon its foundations, given that they were so solid and firm. On the other hand, I compared the writings of the ancient pagans that deal with morals to very proud and very magnificent palaces that were built on nothing but sand and mud. They place virtues on a high plateau and make them appear to be valued more than anything else in the world, but they do not sufficiently instruct us about how to recognize them. And often what they call by so fine-sounding a name is nothing more than a kind of insensibility, pride, desperation, or parricide. I revered our theology, and I desired as much as anyone to reach heaven, but having learned as something very certain that the road to heaven is open no less to the most ignorant than to the most learned, and that the revealed truths guiding us there are beyond our understanding, I would not have dared to submit them to the frailty of my reasonings. And I thought that, in order to undertake an examination of these theological truths, and to succeed in doing so, it would be necessary to have some extraordinary assistance from heaven, and to be more than a man. Concerning philosophy, I shall only say that, seeing that it has been cultivated for many centuries by the most excellent minds that have ever lived, and that, nevertheless, there is still nothing in it about which there is not some dispute, and consequently nothing that is not doubtful, I was not at all so presumptuous as to hope to fare any better there than others, and that, considering how many opinions there can be about the very same matter, that are held by learned people without there ever being the possibility of more than one opinion being true, I deemed everything that was merely probable to be well nigh false. Then, as for the other sciences, I judged that, in so far as they borrow their principles from philosophy, one could not have built anything solid upon such unstable foundations. And neither the honor nor the monetary gain they promise was sufficient to induce me to master them. For I did not perceive myself, thank God, to be in a condition that obliged me to make a career out of science in order to enhance my fortune. And although I did not make a point of rejecting glory after the manner of a cynic, nevertheless, I placed very little value on glory that I could not hope to acquire except through false pretenses. And finally, as to the false doctrines, I thought I already knew well enough what they were worth, so as not to be liable to be deceived either by the promises of an alchemist, the predictions of an astrologer, the tricks of a musician, or the ruses or boasts of any of those who profess to know more than they actually do. That is why, as soon as aid permitted me to emerge from the supervision of my teachers, I completely abandoned the study of letters, and resolving to search for no knowledge other than what could be found within myself, or else in the greater book of the world, I spent the rest of my youth traveling, seeing courts and armies, mingling with people of diverse temperaments and circumstances, gathering various experiences, testing myself in the encounters that fortune offered me, and everywhere engaging in such reflection upon the things that presented themselves that I was able to derive some profit from them. For it seemed to me that I could find much more truth in the reasonings that each person makes concerning matters that are important to him, and whose outcome ought to cost him dearly later on if he is judged badly, than in those reasonings engaged in by a man of letters in his study, with touch on speculations that produce no effect and are of no other consequence to him, except perhaps that the more they are removed from common sense, the more pride he will take in them. For he will have to employ that much more wit and ingenuity in attempting to render them actually plausible. And I have always had an especially great desire to learn to distinguish the true from the false, in order to see my way clearly in my actions, and to go forward with confidence in this life. It is true that, so long as I merely considered the customs of other men, I found hardly anything about which to be confident, and that I noticed there was about as much diversity as I had previously found among the opinions of philosophers. Thus the greatest profit I derived from this was that, on seeing many things, although they seem to us very extravagant and ridiculous, do not cease to be commonly accepted and approved among other great peoples, I learned not to believe anything too firmly of which I had been persuaded by only example and custom, and thus I little by little freed myself from many errors that can darken our natural light, and render us less able to listen to reason. But after I had spent some years thus studying in the book of the world and in trying to gain some experience, I resolved one day to study within myself too, and to spend all the powers of my mind in choosing the paths that I should follow. In this I had much more success, it seems to me, than had I never left either my country or my books. End of part 1.